Good evening. Thank you all for coming and welcome to tonight's panel discussion on the college's endowment. This evening, we will hold the first of what I hope will be a series of open discussions devoted to examining Middlebury's endowment management policies. This is an issue of great interest and importance, and I'm pleased the college is taking a leadership role in engaging in meaningful discussions about a complex issue that cannot be reduced to slogans or sound bites. At present, our endowment finances approximately 20% of the college's annual operating budget, and as a permanent fund helps ensure Middlebury's financial stability, flexibility, and autonomy. The first endowment at Middlebury was $50,000, created by local benefactors in 1816. Today, our endowment is approximately $900 million, which is a testament to the generosity of many thousands of donors and to the acumen of the men and women who've stewarded our endowment over the last 200 years. But Middlebury is more than just a college with a significant endowment. It is a college where the concerns of students are considered carefully, explored deeply, and acted upon with conviction. It's well known that students here were the driving force toward our college's goal of achieving carbon neutrality. In recent years, students have led the goal for major revisions in our Commons residential system, for the retention of winter term, for establishing specific study abroad sites, and for a number of other important college initiatives. This fall, several student groups raised questions regarding Middlebury's endowment, specifically whether and to what extent environmental or social issues should affect our investment policies and practices. As our panelists will surely discuss tonight, the management of our endowment is complex and has evolved over time. Yet the concerns of our students and of our community are real. Speaking for the boards of trustees and the college administration, I would like us to engage these issues thoughtfully and respectfully, and we will begin by tackling two key questions this evening. First, what factors should college trustees consider in determining whether to place new restrictions on the college's investments? And second, what are the pros and cons of using divestment specifically to address concerns such as climate change? Before I introduce David Salem, who will moderate tonight's panel, I wish to say a few words about decorum for the evening. I recognize that many here hold passionate views on the subject of divestment. I admire when students in particular exhibit such passion as they engage and learn about important issues. Yet this passion should not prohibit others from participating in this event. As we hope you noticed upon entering McCullough this evening, we posted some rules for this event. We ask that no one does anything to interfere with others' ability to see or hear tonight's discussion. Anyone who disrupts the event will be asked to leave. And I thank you in advance for your cooperation. David Salem, our moderator, is a well-known and highly respected investment professional who made me promise that I wouldn't take any more than the bare minimum amount of time listing his academic and professional accomplishments. Indeed, he made me promise that I'd simply direct anyone who's interested in David's fuller biography, or indeed that of our other panelists, to go to the designated portion of the college's website and access relevant bios and other information about tonight's program. The URL for the site is middlebury.edu/offices/administration/VPFin/endowment. At the risk of violating my pledge to David, I'll note that he's not only one of our most accomplished living alums, he's also a former member of our Board of Trustees and a proud Middlebury parent. His daughter, Virginia Shannon, completed her Middlebury degree in what else? Environmental Studies, here in 2011. But before David comes to the podium, we need to adhere to Vermont state law by making the following announcement. Please note that emergency exits are located here, there, and in the back behind the bleachers. Also, I should note that the official crowd managers for this evening's event will be Dave Donahue and Stephanie Neal. They will be sitting near the entrance if anyone requires assistance. David and Stephanie, where are you? Raise your hands. There you go. Anyone need assistance? There's your help. And now, it's my pleasure to ask David to come and moderate this evening's panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. I want to start out by echoing your thanks to our panelists, all of whom lead busy lives and could easily fill the time they've devoted to this program with other tasks. Of course, the same could be said for you, our audience, by which I mean not only those of you who are gathered here tonight, but also people watching remotely, in real time or via the video the college will be posting on its website. Mindful as I am that the issues we'll be discussing tonight are as serious as they are emotionally charged, I'll try to inject some humor up front by suggesting that the video alluded to just now should probably contain an upfront warning. Viewer discretion advised. I say this not because I expect anyone in the room tonight to misbehave, but because I expect, and in some respects hope, that this initial forum on divestment will seem boring, if not hopelessly off point to some of you. This isn't because our panelists are inherently boring or obtuse. As you'll see, they're anything but that. Rather, viewer discretion is advised because we're encouraging everyone participating in tonight's program to leave for another day the scientific challenges that lie at the heart of the global debate now underway about climate change. As Ron has emphasized repeatedly in the run-up to tonight's forum, the scientific challenges to which I just alluded are too important and too complex to be taken up, let alone resolved, by tonight's panel. Of course, some would argue that the first college-sponsored event in what will assumedly be a series of conversations about fossil fuel stock divestment should focus not on investing per se, but rather on climate change. You're certainly entitled to that opinion, just as I'm entitled to the opinion, which I am carefully labeling as such, that the mindset and methods used by the most enduringly successful players in my chosen profession, namely money management, these mindsets and methods aren't merely germane to the larger debate about climate change. They're essential, in my opinion, to its proper conduct. To be sure, the mindset and methods to which I'm alluding can seem tedious at best and maddening at worst to many people, including those of us who manage money for a living. Determined as I am to complete momentarily this obligatory warning to viewers so you can hear from our panelists, I won't catalog fully here the tools of my chosen trade that are indeed maddening to many people, and for that very reason, arguably essential in debates over complex issues like climate change and divestment. Rather, I'll simply note that the splendid institution that's brought all of us together here tonight would not have survived, let alone thrived, for 2+ centuries if its leaders hadn't practiced routinely what all enduringly successful investors of whom I'm aware practice, if not also preach. First, think for yourself, questioning rather than merely heeding the opinions of others. Second, base your views on primary as distinct from secondary sources. Third, search aggressively, endlessly, for facts contrary to your evolving thesis, mindful that the inherent cyclicality of most everything in life will eventually test your convictions to the core, pressuring you to reverse course at the worst possible time. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, in terms of long-term efficacy, or what I might prefer to call sustainability, defend at all costs what the founder of another first-rate school called, quote, the illimitable freedom of the human mind. As many of you doubtless know, the academic pioneer who uttered that memorable phrase, the illimitable freedom of the human mind, founded a school whose endowment was headed for a good many years by one of our panelists. A year after this other school's founding, and hence 20 years after Middlebury's, UVA founder Thomas Jefferson noted in a letter to a friend that at his university, quote, "We are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error, so long as reason is left free to combat it." So, secure in the knowledge that as moderator tonight, I will surely commit errors of omission, if not also commission. I want to move immediately into the first substantive part of our program, which will work as follows. I think you know from Ron's call to the meeting tonight, we have about 100 minutes or so. We've asked the panelists to consider joining us for overtime, if you will, and we'll see how that goes. So we're going to divide the allotted time into roughly 2 parts, perhaps better described as 3. The first half will be a series of initial questions that I will pose to each of our panelists in turn, starting at this end of the table and working our way down. And I've asked each of them to be prepared to answer my initial question or questions to them in about 5 or 7 minutes. So we have 6 of them times 5 to 7 minutes. You can do the math. 30 to 42 minutes or so. And then we've encouraged strongly our panelists to cross-examine each other. So hopefully at that point, for 15 or 20 minutes, I will become the proverbial potted plant. At the end of that session, 15 or 20 minutes, so we're now 35 to 50 minutes or so into the whole session, more than halfway, we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. Pursuant to the decorum standards that Ron's already articulated, to a few other rules that I'll articulate along the way. But without further ado, I wanted to ask our first panelist, Patrick Norton, to answer a few questions on your behalf and mine. I think most of you know Patrick's background. He is our Vice President for Finance and Treasurer here at the college, has been for some time, under very difficult circumstances. So he has put in long hours and deserves applaud for that. The questions I put to Patrick ran as follows. Why does the college have an endowment? How materially does it contribute to our ongoing finances? Who decides how much of our endowment gets spent each year and on what basis? Why is the college delegated day-to-day management of its endowment to Investure? And finally, what are the key elements of Investure's mandate from the college? So, Patrick, over to you.
Thanks, David, and all that in 5 minutes. So it's good to be here, and with Middlebury's commitment to the environment and sustainability, I'm glad we're having these discussions. So why does the college have an endowment? Middlebury's endowment was developed through the contribution of hundreds of restricted and unrestricted individual endowments, that is, contributions from mostly individuals that require that the principal be held in perpetuity and that the portion of an endowment be spent on an annual basis using a predetermined spend rate. Restricted endowments may be used only in the manner stipulated by the donor. They may be allocated for a particular program, for example, a named professorship. Unrestricted endowments may be used in any way the college deemed necessary. The role of the college endowment is twofold, and it is a balancing act. First, the endowment is used to support the education of the current generation of Middlebury students, which after all is the college's core mission, through an annual appropriation or distribution from the endowment. This support amounts to $50 million for fiscal year 2013. Now here's where the balancing act comes in. The endowment also is used to support the education of future generations of Middlebury students through the concept of intergenerational equity, whereby the purchasing power of the endowment is preserved. This is achieved through maximizing returns within appropriate risk parameters. Simply stated, if the college has a 5% annual spend rate from the endowment, the return objective would need to be at least 5%, plus a factor for inflation to ensure that the purchasing power of the endowment is maintained and that intergenerational equity is preserved. So how material is the endowment to the college's finances? Well, the college has a $286 million operating budget. We have 3 major sources of revenue to support that budget. By far, the largest source of funding is tuition and fees. 67% of funding for the operating budget comes from the undergraduate and graduate tuition and fees. Another source of funding is through annual expendable non-endowment contributions, which account for 8% of total funding. The last of the three major sources is the annual distribution from the endowment, which accounts for 18%, or $50 million of the funding of the $286 million operating budget. In addition, as the endowment is the largest asset on our balance sheet, rating agencies, banks, and creditors see the college's endowment at nearly $900 million and its annualized performance of 9% over the past 10 years is a credit positive. So who decides how the endowment gets spent and on what basis? A key responsibility of the Board of Trustees, along with setting the comprehensive fee and approving the annual budget, is the setting of the endowment spend rate. The current endowment spend rate is set at 5%, and the college uses a 12-quarter smoothing mechanism to calculate the dollars distributed from the endowment on an annual basis. Simply put, we take the preceding 12 quarters, average market value of the endowment, and multiply by 5% to derive the annual distribution for that year. So why has the college delegated day-to-day management of its endowment to Investor? Well, since 2005, Middlebury has contracted with Investor, a private investment management company, to manage the college's investment portfolio. Investor works in concert with foundations and other college universities, the Investor Consortium, and helps develop guidelines and objectives, allocates assets, selects managers, monitors performance, and administers pooled investment vehicles exclusively to its clients. They are our outsourced investment office and the outside investment office of the other clients. We could have went down three paths for endowment management. First, we could have relied on our investment committee members and staff to serve as the investment office. We could have hired an internal chief investment officer and fully empowered staff to manage the college endowment. Lastly, and a choice we did make, was the outsourced endowment management model. Middlebury's investment officer, Investor, is its founder, to the left of me, Alice Handy. With a combined portfolio of some $9 billion, Investor provides a deep team of professionals and access to investment opportunities comparable to those of large endowments. This is the key reason on why we went with Investor and the outsourced model. Alice and Investor work closely with the investment committee and the board and with my office. Under this arrangement, the Middlebury Investment Committee and board remain the fiduciary and are actively involved in making decisions regarding guidelines, asset allocations, and strategic changes in the portfolio, as well as continually monitoring the balance between performance and risk. The key elements of Investor's mandate from the college and the board are as follows. The endowment's long-term horizon allows for a large allocation to equity-oriented strategies where the potential for long-term capital appreciation exists. The following element is key, and key to our discussion. The endowment is managed to maximize annualized returns, net of all costs, over rolling 10-year periods, while adhering to the stated risk parameters, and here are some of the risk parameters. The endowment is deployed in a manner that seeks to avoid 25% or greater peak-to-trough declines in unit value. In order to provide enough liquidity, endowment seeks to keep a manageable percent of the assets out of lockups to provide that liquidity. And also, the endowment is structured to avoid annualized shortfalls exceeding 3% relative to the mean average or the mean return of large endowments reporting to the National Association of College and University Business Officers over a rolling 10-year period. So I want to close with two things. First, as the Chief Financial Officer of the college, my primary role is to provide for the continued funding of the current operations and the educational mission of the college, along with the long-term preservation of the college's assets. Divestment discussions would need to take that into consideration. And second, as trustees of a charitable organization, the Board of Trustees would need to be fully aware of how the possible divestment from and screening for investments in fossil fuels interrelates with the prudent investor standard and the trustee's fiduciary duty, as the energy sector is a large portion of the investment space.
Thank you, Patrick. Terrific. So next up is Alice Handy. Per Ron's opening statement, we're not going to take time, because it's pretty limited here tonight, to talk about anybody's particular biographical background, but you already have no doubt inferred that Alice is the person to whom I was alluding, who managed the University of Virginia endowment for a good many years. She was also treasurer of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and has quite a list of accomplishments. And then not long before Middlebury made the decision, which was much less conventional back in the day, has become more popular for what we might call smaller and medium-sized endowments to outsource, she founded Investure, based in Charlottesville, Virginia. So we're delighted, Alice, you were willing to make the trip back to Middlebury. She's been here many times to answer some questions for us, and they run as follows. While highlighting as you see fit any elements of Investor's mission or mandate not already flagged by Patrick, please explain why Investor relies so heavily on commingled funds to meet its clients' needs. Also, what constraints, if any, other than our endowment's basic risk parameters, govern Investor's deployment of our endowment? Given tonight's focus on divestment, we'd also be grateful if you discuss specifically any so-called ESG criteria that Investor employs as it goes about its work on our behalf. And ESG, as I'm sure most of the folks in the room know, is our industry speak for environmental, social, and governance criteria. Alice, over to you.
Great. Thank you for having me. Investor was created as an outsourced investment office for endowments and foundations who believe that they either lacked the resources or the circumstances to create their own in-house internal office. And by pooling smaller endowments together, and foundations also, into one consortium, which Patrick noted, we hope to provide a level of service and investment resources that would be difficult for any of our clients to achieve on their own. We provide a very high-touch service and have a limited client group of over just a dozen clients, and we focused exclusively on serving not-for-profit institutions who typically share many common attributes and goals. 6 colleges, like Middlebury, and 7 charitable foundations, all of whom have truly wonderful missions. We strive to provide a service level comparable to that of individually managed investment office, and we like to think that Patrick and Ron think that we are, and President Leibowitz think that we are in Middlebury, Vermont, and not in Charlottesville, Virginia. We created a mission statement which was created by our entire team. Actually, it was some of the younger members of our team, but adopted by our entire team, and I think it's important here. It reads, "We are stewards of our clients' trust. Our mission is to protect and grow their capital so that they can expand their collective presence in the world. We will do this by 1, remaining open to change, 2, embracing continuous improvement, and 3, serving with transparency and integrity." We, like everyone here, want to leave the world a better place and believe that we can contribute to that goal by working to provide Middlebury and our other clients with the resources necessary to continue their very important missions. But I'm here today as part of the Middlebury team. Over the years, we've made all decisions with our clients in mind, and we'll always try to do what's best for Middlebury. In practice, our clients pool their assets together into commingled funds managed by Investor, which have varying levels of liquidity. This allows all our clients to have access to our very best ideas, and so that we don't have issues of favoring one over another. Another key benefit of this practice is increased negotiating power that our clients have by acting together rather than as 14 separate entities. Being able to invest in larger increments allows us to procure better terms and fee structures with our managers, and that in turn improve returns for our clients. An additional benefit of the pooled funds is increased savings in administrative fees for our clients to share operational costs, regulatory compliance costs, audits, legal, investment, and operational due diligence. Our clients are a consortium solving common problems that they all share. Due diligencing Investor is one of the many examples that all of our clients can take comfort that there are so many eyes watching what we do. But while acting as a consortium has many advantages, and while colleges and foundations share many similarities, they don't all feel the same passion about all issues. Divestment, for instance, will require a buy-in by all of our group. Our consortium has come together, however, to tackle many hard and important issues. For instance, one of our clients felt very passionate about proxy voting policies, which was set forth to the group, and after considerable education and deliberation, the group concurred with the distribution of the policy to all investment managers. Similarly, we were able to establish a sustainability fund in which 3 of our clients participated, including Middlebury. This fund was designed to jumpstart investments in this area, but the long-term goal was that it would be disbanded when companies began investing in sustainable ways in the mainstream, and it showed up in our portfolio in general. This is starting to happen. I'm sure you've read the headlines recently about the $260 billion that's been invested in sustainable investments in the past year by regular companies out there doing good things. This is starting to happen, albeit in a very limited way. So in addition to the Sustainability Fund, Middlebury has about $6 million invested in very specific private equity investments in the environmental area, and another $29 million in a manager who uses ESG criteria to make all of its investments. I promise you that we'll approach divestment with the same attitude towards listening to your concerns and developing a plan that works for the entire consortium. So what are the additional constraints that we need to share with you about the fund's construction? For the most part, investor doesn't buy and sell stocks. Rather, we invest in commingled funds. And the independent investors who run these commingled funds buy and sell stocks on Middlebury's behalf. Stocks as well as bonds and real estate and commodities and other investments. We do this so we can access what we believe to be the world's best investors. The world's best investors typically like to operate within commingled funds, which have the practical implications of being easier to administer and assure that all investors get the same access to the best ideas. But by investing in commingled funds, we also give up a certain amount of control, including improving individual investments, voting proxies, custodying our assets with our bank, and our ability to exit at the time of our choosing due to lockups. So this begs the question, why invest with world-class investors? Maybe Middlebury could get by with a passive approach or just above average managers. In the world of modest return expectations, meeting your 5% spending requirement annually is a tough hurdle. If you add on to that inflation of some 3%, that makes an 8% return necessary, which we expect will be hard to come by in the coming years. You just heard Patrick talk about how it had been 9% for the last 10 years. We also operate with other constraints. We realize how vital Middlebury's endowment is to the school's programs, professors, and students, and we act very cautiously and judiciously to serve as stewards of your capital. We consider a countless number of risks before we deploy any single dollar, and there are broad swaths of investment strategy and geographies that we avoid altogether because we're uncomfortable with the associated risks, both investment and headline. We are focused on acting with the utmost integrity, and we hold the managers to that very same bar. There is one particular guiding principle associated with our investment approach, and that is the long-term approach. Middlebury is a perpetual institution, one that hopes to thrive for many centuries to come. This is true not just of Middlebury, but for all of investors' client, which gives us a tremendous advantage in the investment world. By focusing exclusively on the long term with investment strategies, we are able to choose investments that will grow in value over the years and decades. But given this long-term orientation, we are naturally attracted to managers who own stocks that are responsible, of companies that are responsible, long-term oriented, and sustainable. Investor promises you to be open-minded, and we promise to work with Middlebury's board and administration to think of creative solutions. Our number one priority is to support all of our clients so that we can all work together to make the world a better place.
Thanks, Alex. Next up will be Charlie Arnowitz. Many of you know Charlie, a senior here at the college, head of our Student Government Association, and we're very grateful to Charlie for agreeing to participate on relatively short notice, but I think he's done a great job preparing. Well, we've asked Charlie to address up front, and as with the other panelists, and some of you will have an opportunity to supplement as the program unwinds. We've asked him to summarize the result of a survey of our current students respecting divestment and to comment more generally on the process by which student views, whether dissenting or consensus, should shape endowment management policies, if not also other institutional aims and values here at Middlebury. So Charlie, over to you.
Great. Well, first off, thanks so much for convening this panel, and to my fellow panelists for schlepping up to cold Vermont. This is an issue that many students care deeply about, even if we don't all agree. I think in my 4 years at Middlebury, it's almost certainly the single campus issue that's inspired the most campus dialogue among students, particularly in the last year or so. Dialogue's healthy, so it's fantastic to have this group of experts together. Second, a big thank you for including a student on the panel. Of course, I can't represent the diverse viewpoints of all students, and it's of course also important to recognize that many of the communities and folks impacted by these issues aren't represented here tonight. I'm certainly no expert on this stuff, so I'll let those who are explain themselves, but I do know Middlebury's student body, so I'll take the opportunity to briefly discuss student viewpoints. Middlebury, of course, is a diverse community comprised of students, faculty, staff, alumni, parents, trustees, and others. But students, I think, deserve unique consideration, and not just because 67% of the operating budget is tuition and fees. I think in general the administration realizes that students deserve unique consideration. More than at many other institutions, student opinions are a key legitimator of administrative decisions here. With respect to the last part of David's question, while we greatly respect the institutional mechanisms of the college to set policy, we also insist that students be at the table and that student views then be taken into account. Let me then talk about where students stand on this particular issue. Obviously, we have a diversity of views, differing levels of passion. Some students, notably the SRI group, who deserve, frankly, a lot of praise for their diligent work, have been engaging directly with the administration on this issue. And of course, it's vitally important that the college reach out to groups of students from all across campus with all sorts of views and, in many cases, non-views on this issue. So here are some numbers based on the Student Government Association's recent survey, which you should all take. As of 3 o'clock, had a little over 1,000 respondents, 1,031, around 45% of the student body. It's still open. So 63% of respondents believe that the college should apply the principles of socially responsible investing to its endowment. 14% were opposed, and 23% had no opinion. In terms of prioritizing socially responsible investment, 28% of respondents thought it was not particularly important, 32% thought it was somewhat important, and 40%, a plurality, thought it was very or extremely important. In terms of divestment, students favored a diversity of approaches. 38% of students, a plurality, supported divestment from both arms manufacturers and the top 200 fossil fuel companies. 10%, above that, supported prioritized fossil fuels. 12% prioritized arms manufacturers, so a total of, again, that 60% number supporting some form of divestment. 15% don't support divestment, and 25% have no opinion. So all things considered, we can see that a plurality of students, and by students I here mean respondents to my survey, care deeply about this issue and support some kind of action. And I'd imagine they support that action happening in the near term, including, I think, commitments from the board. Having 2 student members sitting on the investment committee of the Board of Trustees is a fantastic step, but I don't think students see that as an end game in and of itself. Positions just don't have that function. It's also important to mention that there are many students for whom this issue takes a real back seat. 28% think it's not particularly important, 32% only somewhat important, and a minority of students who actively oppose divestment and, to a lesser extent, socially responsible investment. And it is a truth universally acknowledged that it is important to our education that Middlebury's endowment be robust in the context of our moral values. And everyone defines each of those things on his or her own terms. Every student's voice is legitimate. Let me therefore conclude by requesting to our community that we not demonize fellow community members on this issue. No one at Middlebury is talking about whether climate change is real or whether climate change has a devastating impact on real communities. The question instead is, what is the most effective way to steer the debate on this major issue, the issue of our generation, and to have an impact? Is it divestment? Is it more consciously engaging in socially responsible investment? Is it something else, maybe something more impactful? I look forward to hearing from the expert panelists and perhaps finding out.
Thanks, Charlie. Next up is Mark Kritzman, a very widely published author in the field of investments, also an adjunct member of the faculty at MIT, where he teaches a very interesting course, and some of those techniques I think will work their way into his presentation here tonight. So we're particularly grateful to Mark for making the trip up here. He has a very early flight out of Logan Airport tomorrow morning out to California to give a talk. So all of our gratitude flows to you, Mark, and other panelists for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you. I know you have some slides.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Charlie, for setting the stage. And I just want to say that I'm very privileged to be here. So I'm going to do the exciting part of this panel. It's the math part, okay? And what I'm going to do is describe to you and measure for you the cost of socially responsible investing. I know you all accept that there's a cost, right? So I'm going to tell you how you go about measuring it and what it is. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I want to distinguish socially responsible investing from active management. Okay? And then what I want to do is, I'm not going to give you the answer for the second part, but I'm going to just give you my views about how you might go about measuring the impact of restricting your investment universe. And what I'm going to focus on is how you go about determining how costly it is to reduce your opportunity set. So I want to say at the outset, I do not, or let me put it this way, well, I do not have a view as to whether you should restrict your investment universe or not. But I have a view that you should at least understand the consequences of these two choices when you make that decision. So just to make this more math-like than it might otherwise be, I'm not going to talk about fossil fuels or any particular social agenda. I'm just going to say that there are companies that you want to restrict from your investment universe, and we'll refer to those as bad companies. And then there are the rest, and we'll refer to those as either neutral or good. So if an investor decides to restrict investment in a certain category of companies because they think those companies will do less well than other companies, that is not socially responsible investing. That's active management, right? That's an investment strategy. That companies that meet certain standards are better than companies that don't meet those standards, right? That's an active investment management strategy. Socially responsible investing is where you substitute a company that you would otherwise hold for a company that you would otherwise not hold, right? So even if so-called good companies on average outperform so-called bad companies on average, if you substitute one good company for a bad company, and the bad company has better expected performance than the good company, right, there's a cost associated with doing that. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands that distinction. This is just logic. And it's actually been written about by some fairly prominent lawyers. So let me just tell you how I would think about measuring the impact of restricting your investment universe. There are several channels by which this could be effective. The first is that if you sell these companies or choose not to invest in these companies, you raise their cost of capital. You drive down the returns and thereby raise their cost of capital. And by doing so, you hope to reform their behavior. Right? So that's one channel. And the extent to which that's effective is an empirical issue. Another channel is that you choose not to invest in these companies, and you draw attention to this fact. And by doing so, you convince consumers not to purchase their products or services, right? So you drive down their revenues. So that's another potential channel by which you can have an economic impact. And the third channel is that you engage, you restrict investment in these companies, right? You draw attention to this, and by moral suasion, you convince management of these companies to reform, right? There may be other channels, I'm not sure what they are, but these are the three channels that occur to me. Whether or not these channels are effective, to me, is an empirical issue. I can think about it and try to design experiments to figure that out, and I'm sure that is doable, but what is, I'm not sure how reliably you can come up with those estimates. But what is pretty trivial to do, and I'll show you this in just a minute, is to measure the cost of restricting your investment universe. Okay, so this is the fun part. This is the math part. So it is an inarguable mathematical truth that socially responsible investing is costly, assuming that the investor is skillful. And we all know, I don't think there's anybody in this room who will doubt that the investors Alice chooses are skillful, right? Okay, so that's the least controversial thing tonight. Moreover, it's pretty simple to estimate the cost. So we can actually come up with a dollar number for the Middlebury Endowment Fund. All right? So I'm going to tell you what it is, approximately. Okay, the most fun slide. We're going to use Monte Carlo simulation. So Monte Carlo simulation is just a mathematical procedure for basically representing something that is unobservable. Okay? It's a way of pre-experiencing the future. It's unbiased. So what we're going to do is start with an investment universe. So we have a universe of stocks that we would otherwise invest in. Say it's all of the stocks in the world. Okay? And then we're going to rank their performance from top to bottom. So we rank them best performing stock, second best performing stock, all the way down to the worst performing stock. Okay? And then what we're going to do, so if you were a perfectly foresightful investor, you would just start at the top, and well, actually you just buy the stock at the top, right? But basically what you'll do, you're going to buy 250 stocks, you're going to start at the top and buy the 250. So if you have perfect foresight, that's what you would do. But you don't. You have some level of skill, which means that you're going to make some mistakes. So the way we're going to capture that is randomly switch stocks from the bottom half of the universe with stocks from the top half. So if we switch them all, then we would just have noise, there'd be no skill. But if we only switch some of them, right, and you still pick from the top, mostly you're going to pick outperforming stocks if we just switch a few of them. The more stocks we switch, the less likely you'll pick outperforming stocks. Okay, but we can control the amount we switch based on how skillful you are, right? And so that's what we do. So we now have this this universe of stocks where we've introduced noise. The amount of noise we introduced is reflective of how skillful you are as an investor. So then we just pick the top 250 stocks. If you're very skillful, most of those stocks will be outperforming stocks. If you're just marginally skillful, slightly more than 50% will be outperforming stocks. So everybody get it so far? Pretty straightforward. Then what we're going to do is go back to this universe of stocks where we've introduced this noise by doing this little switching, and we're going to eliminate those stocks that you want to restrict. Okay? And then we're going to go through the same process. So we're going to end up with two portfolios. One portfolio chosen from the unrestricted universe, where we introduce noise, and another portfolio chosen from the restricted universe, where we introduce the noise. And we're going to look at the performance, and the difference in the performance is the cost in that one experiment of restricting your opportunity set. But we're going to do it 10,000 times, so we get the average. So I'm hoping you're following me. I know it's hard to concentrate when this is so exciting, but just bear with me. So here's the answer, all right? We're going to round up for Middlebury. We're going to assume you've got $1 billion. I guess you have, what, 900 million or thereabouts? Alice will get you up to $1 billion soon. And I'm going to show you the cost in millions of dollars over these different periods, depending on whether you're investing in the U.S. stock market, the European and Asian stock market, the developed world stock market, or the entire stock market. So what you see is that over 5 years, I'll just give you the two extremes. Over 5 years, if you have a $1 billion portfolio, you choose 250 stocks. You can change all of these inputs, right? These are just numbers. If you're right just 52% of the time, this is not a huge amount of skill. Alice will, I'm sure, hire managers that have much better odds. And if you exclude 20% of the universe, right, it will cost you over 5 years about $17 million. If you invest across the entire world where there's greater dispersion from the best and the worst performing stocks, and over 20 years, it will cost you $420 million. Now, you can change any of the assumptions I've made. You can, there's a paper behind this, which I'm happy to send you if you email me, that goes into a lot more detail. But, this is true. Okay, this is the reality. This is the cost of restricting your opportunity set, which is not, I'm not here to say you shouldn't do that, right? What I'm here to say, if I were you, I'd think about it this way. I have this choice. I can restrict my opportunity set and pursue those other channels of moral suasion or raising the company's cost of capital or raising awareness amongst consumers to not buy these products. And I can estimate how impactful that would be on changing the behavior of these companies, of basically of achieving the goal that I want to achieve, right? And that could be extremely effective. I don't know. I haven't done that analysis. Or I could not restrict investment. I could save this $420 million over the next 20 years, and I could deploy it directly toward achieving the goal that I'd like to achieve. That's how I would see this question that you're faced with tonight. So let me just close by saying there are two inarguable facts. One is that the efficacy of socially responsible investing can only be measured empirically. The cost of socially responsible investing can be determined reliably by simulation, by mathematics. And you can put in whatever numbers you like. You don't have to agree with my inputs. Put in whatever views you have about the skill, whatever. So those are two facts. And I'm happy for anybody to challenge me on those facts, but they're not really, you really can't debate those. Those are just facts. My opinion is that well-intentioned investors should measure these two approaches and decide which they believe to be most effective. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Mark. I'll ask our panelists to reconvene up here. We'll turn to Ralph Earl next.
That was fun. That was the best math class.
While they're rejoining him on the stage, I'm asked often, well, maybe not often, but from time to time, why do I think people in the money management business on average tend to make so much money? And I think one plausible answer is because we have to, in our day jobs, day after day, after hour, work through stuff like that. And you would demand a high wage if you had to put up with that. That's by way of compliment to Mark. But it can be, as I said at the outset, pretty tedious, and we will have ample opportunity after we hear from Ralph and Bill to have the panelists cross-examine each other about some of Mark's assertions. Also grateful to Ralph for making the trip up from Boston today. As you'll see on the college website, Ralph has spent virtually his entire career working on environmental issues. And what I thought I would do with Ralph, as he knows, and the other panelists do as well, is pose simply the following upfront question. What are your reactions to what you've heard thus far from the panel? And I'm thinking particularly of Charlie's, I thought, very effective summary of where student opinion is on the issue of divestment. So, Ralph, please.
Good evening. Thank you, David. Thank you, President Leibowitz, for having this panel. I think climate change is the most critical issue we face as a society today. I also want to say just at the start, and by way of full disclosure, I am fortunate to be married to a spectacular woman who is responsible for the Harvard University endowment. My views that I express tonight are entirely my own and not hers at all. As some of you who may have met her, trying to persuade her to do something that she doesn't agree with is a Sisyphean task. But she's great. I also want to thank Bill. Bill has shown tireless leadership on climate change, which, as I said, I think is the most critical issue of our time. I am in complete agreement with 350.org's goals and indeed have read several of Bill's books. I've spent virtually my entire career working towards reducing environmental impacts, and in the past 10 years have focused those efforts exclusively on reducing the impacts of climate change. However, as much as I agree with 350.org, and as much as I think that there are important, critical, and substantive steps that colleges and universities can take to address climate change, and I'd like to address some of those at the end of my remarks, I don't think that divestiture of fossil fuel stocks will be effective in reducing climate change. And I say this for several reasons. First and foremost, I just don't think divestiture is going to have much impact. Endowments have broadly divested their portfolios in response to at least three major social issues: apartheid in South Africa, the health depredations of tobacco, and the genocide in the Sudan. In at least two of these instances, it's not clear that divestiture had any impact whatsoever. In the case of tobacco, the divestment took place in the mid to late 80s, culminating really in 1990, and really didn't have a negative impact on the industry. For example, if one had invested in the S&P 500, a broad index of stocks, in 1990, today that investment would be worth roughly 3.5 times your original investment. If you'd invested in Philip Morris at that exact same date, Philip Morris is the largest tobacco company in the world, your investment would be worth roughly 6 times your individual investment, or roughly double what the S&P 500 would have returned. I think in the case of the tobacco industry, divestiture has not hurt the industry financially. In the case of the Sudan, it's not clear that divestiture has any impact. According to Human Rights Watch, conditions in the Sudan are just as bad today as they were in the mid-2000s when the vast majority of the divestitures took place. Finally, and critically important, a significant number of the world's largest fossil fuel companies aren't publicly traded. That means that divestiture wouldn't affect and might help competitively some of the largest oil companies in the world, including Saudi Aramco, the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, and the National Iranian Oil Company. A second reason I don't think that divestiture will be effective is that if colleges and universities do decide to divest, they will lose their ability to vote proactively for corporate initiatives that could help prevent climate change. I personally view proxy voting as one of the most valuable steps that we can take to change corporate cultures and decision-making. There were over 100 proxy questions on climate change last year. It's growing at about 20% a year, and I fully expect that growth to continue. While stepping away from the table should always be an option, in this case, I think it will unnecessarily eliminate the potential for colleges and universities to vote their shares in favor of specific opportunities for positive change. Third, the greatest short to medium term possibility for significantly reducing the United States' reliance the United States generation of greenhouse gases is the coming online of vast supplies of inexpensive natural gas. Natural gas, clearly a fossil fuel, has roughly half the warming potential of coal, and given its currently low price and rapidly expanding supply, presents a massive opportunity for fuel switching from coal to gas in the near future. Indeed, it's already taking place, and in no small part due to that switching, the U.S. emissions of CO2 are now dropping faster than those in Europe and are 14% lower than they were in 2007, despite the complete and embarrassing and shameful absence of a national policy on carbon. While there are significant issues with the new gas, environmental issues from fracking and climate effects from fugitive emissions, the potential for large supplies of relatively low carbon fuels represents good news for our efforts to mitigate climate emissions until broad-based and economically viable renewables can come online. Given their infrastructure, capital, and expertise, oil and gas companies in particular are likely to be primary movers behind getting this new fuel to market. Fourth, and related, it's my view that the entire fossil fuel industry is too broad a target. Coal is by far the most egregious actor when it comes to greenhouse gases, and it seems to me that targeting the entire fossil fuel industry for action is overly blunt. Whatever strategies colleges and universities adopt to address climate change, they should be directed primarily at those firms with the greatest impact on climate change: coal producers and utilities using coal-fired technologies to generate electricity. So while I question the effectiveness of divestiture as a step in addressing climate change, I strongly believe that there is ample room for universities to play a more central, coordinated, and aggressive role in promoting our need to move to a carbon-free economy. I offer the following as potential alternatives, alternative steps that colleges and universities might take. The first is proxy voting. I believe that endowments can be utilized as a positive force for change on the climate issue. One manner in which this can be accomplished is through a coordinated, rigorous, and widely publicized proxy voting process, coordinated across universities and based upon sound principles of corporate governance. For example, of the 5 largest oil companies in the United States, only one of them has any single board member who has any environmental expertise. If we are to create effective change within the industry, that has got to change. Investing and voting for proxy proposals to require environmental board representation would be a significant step to changing the way the industry sees the issue. However, you can't vote if you're not a shareholder. I would note that, at least in my view, to be maximally effective, university and college votes need to be widely publicized, and that colleges and universities need to be prepared to initiate proxy votes when and where they deem appropriate. My second suggestion relates to the aggressive evaluation of renewables technology and investment opportunities. Ultimately, the path to a carbon-free economy has to be paved with equal attention to basic research, applied research, technology commercialization, and investment. These are all activities that are central to the institutions of higher education. Efforts to remove academic discipline or institution-based barriers to collaborative research must be encouraged. Technology licensing needs to be streamlined and technology transfer from academia to the commercial sector made a priority. Endowment managers need to actively seek investments that facilitate the development and commercialization of new fuels, new forms of power generation, energy efficiency, and energy storage technologies. Finally, what can students do? Well, I would argue to encourage, cajole, and/or push your college to do the things I've just suggested. But I have 2 other suggestions that go beyond the campus. First, what if every one of you, upon graduation, signed a pledge never to buy a vehicle that got less than 50 miles a gallon? Transportation represents about 30% of our carbon emissions, and there are now several choices of cars that get that kind of performance. You are the consumers of tomorrow, and the choices you make not only affect your individual carbon footprint, but also drive the marketplace. Second, shift your own fuel consumption from coal to renewables, if they're available, or natural gas. Today, 24 states have deregulated electricity markets and allow choice between electricity providers. Find out how your utility generates electricity. If it's from coal, fire them. Move your business to somebody who uses renewables or gas. If where you live doesn't have deregulated markets, work to make them deregulated so that you have that choice. Finally, I'd like to encourage all of you to embed the issue of climate change into your personal and career choices. This is a multi-generational problem that will not be solved overnight. And frankly, I think our generation has failed you. Whether you choose clean energy as a career, and I strongly recommend it, or seek to influence the decision of your employer directly, solving this challenge requires the best minds to work hard, think critically, creatively, and focus on impact. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to the conversation to follow.
Thanks, Ralph. Our sixth and final set of opening remarks will be from Bill McKibben. To say that Bill has spent some time thinking about environmental issues is like saying Roger Federer has played a little bit of tennis. In fact, in light of how carefully and thoroughly Bill has articulated his views on climate change and divestment through his writings plus events on this campus and many others, we've asked Bill, as he knows, to focus his opening remarks not on the reasons why he favors fossil fuel stock divestment, but rather on the process that he would encourage our board to employ if it sought to give full and fair consideration to student calls for fossil fuel stock divestment. To comment on the specific steps our board should take if it wants to take up this issue in earnest and do so in a manner that, as Bill himself discussed in Mead Chapel the other day, could serve as a role model or ideal for the governing boards of other schools to emulate. And while Bill has the floor, as he knows, I'll also encourage him to discuss, as he sees fit, any aspect of his fellow panelists' opening remarks with which he disagrees. Bill.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here in McCullough. I'm, as usual, feeling a little nervous to be speaking in front of my community. And as I've been sitting here, this sort of creeping feeling of sort of low net worth has kind of been, you know, falling over me. I will do my best, though, just to go where I can. I'm very glad. I think the first thing to be said is if you want to know what students have to think about this, it's probably a good idea to ask them and have them on panels like this. I'm glad that Charlie was added at the... I'm glad that Charlie... You know what? I'd be so grateful if people don't applaud because I'm nervous to begin with. And also I've got a lot to say. I'm not going to go quite as long as Mark, but I might go just a minute over what I was supposed to say. Okay, I'm very glad that Charlie was added at the last minute, and I'm very glad that he brought us that news about what students here think, because if you listen to the numbers, it's an absolute landslide. Eric Davis or Matt Dickerson could correct me, but I don't think any American presidential election's ever been decided by as large a margin as 60 to 15. And I'm pretty sure that that same set of numbers holds at the other colleges that are joining us on live stream tonight because they're investor colleges. A real shout out to people at Barnard and Dickinson and Trinity and Smith and Tulsa, and also to the 205 other campuses around the country where there are active divestment movements underway now. The request we make tonight is a sober and conservative one that's already been agreed to by 2 colleges and by the government of the city of Seattle, that we pledge in the course of the spring semester not to invest new money in the 200 biggest fossil fuel companies, and that we spend the next 5 years winding down those positions. And because of Middlebury's long-standing commitment to international relations, students here have asked for divestment on the same terms from arms manufacturers. We've been asked to stay away from moral arguments tonight, but let me just say that moral considerations are at the base of this fight. And they have been from the very beginning, and one is reminded with David's excellent introduction that this is a thread that runs through this whole conversation. It's a good thing to quote Thomas Jefferson, and it's a really good thing to remember that he was a morally compromised individual in all kinds of ways, and that there were colleges that invested in slavery at that time and have, because it was perfectly legal, and have spent the last few decades apologizing for that work. One understands that slavery and climate change are not the same thing, but one also might guess that 100 years from now, people will look back on our time with some of the same disbelief that people were not taking action against what was a clear and present danger. In this case, it makes no moral or practical sense to pay for the education of Middlebury students by investing in companies whose business plan guarantees they will not have a planet to enact that education on. I was very grateful to Patrick for talking about the intergenerational equity that an endowment represents. Part of that intergenerational equity is making sure that 100 years from now in Middlebury, we not only have money here, we have a Vermont here that works for people to come to, that we have some way to deal with it. And if it is wrong to wreck the climate, it is wrong to profit from that wreckage. At this point, by the way, Mr. Earle's comments notwithstanding, gas will do just as efficient a job, or almost, as that of coal. The latest NOAA evidence released last week shows horrifying rates of methane leakage from fracking fields that make it, if anything, worse than coal if those numbers hold up. The latest International Energy Agency study shows that a world that converted entirely to gas, would still see its temperature rise 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? As to arms, we reach tipping points there too. In fact, tipping points was precisely the term used by the California State Teachers Retirement Fund when the day after the Newtown massacre, they divested their holdings. Maybe for us, it's the news today that yet another gunman has shot up a school, college, this time in Texas. Maybe it's the reflection, given the demographics of Middlebury, that one or two of those Connecticut kindergartners could easily have grown up to be member of our class of 2028. Okay? No more. I won't go on in this vein, though I could. Let me make my second point. Divestment should, I agree, be a rarely used option. In most cases, the kind of shareholder pressure on companies that Mr. Earle recommends can win real change. If Apple pays low wages to Chinese workers, it does not mean that we have to get rid of Apple. It doesn't mean that we hate iPhones. It means that we pass a shareholder resolution asking them to pay fair wages. But these industries are different. There's not a fixable flaw in the fossil fuel industry's business plan. The flaw is the business plan, which involves burning 5 times more carbon than even the most conservative government on Earth says is safe. Those were my figures last summer, borrowed from financial analysts in the UK, but in the course of the fall, there are figures that have been validated by the World Bank and the International Energy Agency. The carbon bubble that we're now experiencing will be by far the greatest bubble that we have ever faced unless we are able to remove the social license of those industries and prevent them from burning that carbon. Third, morality must be joined by effectiveness. Our hope is not, and I want to make this clear, that we can bankrupt companies like Exxon. We can't. We're completely unconcerned with the day-to-day movement of stock prices. We do think history shows that the attention generated by divestment can change the course of events. No guarantees, of course. Mr. Earle's correct that there's no silver bullet and that maybe 2 of the 3 divestment things didn't entirely work out. Given the fix that we're in with climate change, I'd take 1 in 3 odds as pretty good, frankly. Still, the 1 in 3 chance he cites, the South Africa one where things did work out, is tremendously important. And as John Elder demonstrated last Sunday in Mead Chapel and in the beautiful essay that he has handed out to you tonight, divestment played a very key role in that fight. In fact, those of you who are in Mead Chapel heard Desmond Tutu remind us what a key role divestment had played in the liberation of South Africa and ask us to repeat this exercise in part because of the tremendous unearned suffering that people in Africa are now undergoing from climate change. But would it work in this case? Would it still work? Here's the testimony last week of former Utah Governor John Huntsman, a Republican from the reddest state in the Union, a newspaper story. Huntsman applauded the growing student-led movement for divestment. I think it's a good thing, and I can tell you from serving on some big corporate boards that when things like that happen, it's taken seriously. You can move the need from a policy standpoint by taking action. Leave it up to kids on campuses to do what they think is right, and in many cases you'll find you're ahead of the curve in terms of policy, quote unquote. Remember also that effectiveness needs to be measured against what we're doing at the moment. So Mr. Earl gives us, for instance, a set of policies that people have been following for a long time. Let's try to use less carbon in our lives, drive better cars, make personal commitments. Those are all important things to do. My car gets even more than 50 miles to the gallon. And the Arctic melted last summer. Okay? We have to up our game and do a lot more than what we have done in the past. The old generation has failed us, so it is time now to do the next. Fourth, nothing comes for free, and we're well aware of and grateful for the college's endowment. If, as Mr. Christmas says, we put a few stocks off limit to our endowment managers, that adds some risk. It's as if you had a herd of wildebeest with 20 watering holes to choose from, and one dried up. The question is, how much risk will be added? He gave you one forward-looking method. In fact, there's actually only been one study that I know of that looks at this field in particular. It was released in December by the Aperio Group. It quantified the risk for excluding the entire fossil fuels, metal and mining, electric utility, and independent power producers sector, a much larger sector than we've asked for. It found that it would increase absolute portfolio risk by 0.0133% with a theoretical return penalty of 0.0044% or less than 1/2 of a basis point. So not nothing, but pretty close to nothing, a small risk. Even, well, 5. Endowment return is not the only financial indicator to worry about. Colleges depend on a steady flow of donations and hence of goodwill. Here we have some evidence to offer. The president of Unity College in Maine, the first college in the country to divest, reported last week that donations to the college had increased substantially in the wake of their divestment announcement, and that there had been a significant uptick in inquiries and applications, the basis of the 67% of our finances that Patrick described. In fact, we've already heard from a number of excellent high schools around the country where students are organizing to ask their potential college choices whether or not they have divested going forward. So this is an important thing to think about as we continue to try to attract the best students that we possibly can. 6, consistency, logical consistency, intellectual consistency, which is of course a part of our thinking here, demands that we take such a move. President Leibowitz correctly asked for decorum and civility at this forum and in all our campus life, and that's what we should definitely aim for, and it doesn't correspond with, say, manufacturing assault rifles that, as we've seen, can turn classrooms into horror shows. We've been leaders from the start in sustainability, one of the earliest signers on the President's Pledge of Carbon Neutrality, which makes me incredibly proud, and I have sung the praises of this campus from one end of this country to the other over and over and over again. It makes no sense to green the campus without also greening the portfolio. It would be like saying we're going to build energy-efficient buildings north of Route 125 and build the old-fashioned kind south of Route 125. Consistency is an important part of what it means to have any kind of witness. 7, and finally, let me say that though I am no investment pro, okay, I know people who are. And I want to bring one person's testimony in particular to bear here. This is a statement that arrived this afternoon from Tom Steyer, who was able to join us on campus over the weekend. Tom is a more successful investor than anybody else here. How do I know this? Because this is one thing we actually can measure quite easily. He made more money than anybody else, okay? In fact, his personal fortune is half again as large as the Middlebury Endowment. And he earned it as the founder of a hedge fund to which others have entrusted $20 billion of their money. Anyone can talk about hitting home runs, but when you really want to get the story, go ask Ted Williams, okay? He's also extraordinarily generous, one of the first American billionaires to pledge to give away half his wealth, and he's given much of it to institutions like Stanford, where he sits on the board. Before my friends in the development office get too mad at me, let me just say I did my level best to set up meetings between him and our senior administrators while he was here, but people had tight schedules, yes, Ron, and it did not work. He did, however, meet with the grooming staff at Breadloaf, and he had such a good time there that I hope he will be back, okay, in the future. Anyway, his eloquent letter, which John Isham will distribute copies of when I'm done talking, makes 3 points. 3 points. The first is, This can be done, even though we have commingled funds, even though we have many managers. As he put it, 5 years is plenty of time to wind down positions. I can tell you from my experience building one of the country's larger hedge funds that this is entirely possible and well within the skills of your expert advisors who I know and respect. The second thing he said, it is a good investment strategy. The research, he points out, makes clear that any return penalty would be small, but as he adds, in any event, good investors rarely look backwards. As others come to realize, as Middlebury's science departments long ago did, that climate change is a profound risk, fossil fuel stocks will come under increasing pressure. Knowing this in advance gives you an edge relative to those investors. The same kind of edge, it must be said, that was supplied by our Environmental Studies Department when it urged the transition from oil to biomass in our burners. At the time, oil was $40 a barrel, and we made the case that it made some sense, but we predicted that the price of oil would go up to $80 or $100 a barrel, which it has. And Patrick, yes, this has saved us considerable sums of money over time. The point is we have skill here, and it makes sense to use it. For Tom Steyer, and this is important and significant and new, and this is no idle talk, he said today, I have directed my financial team to divest my holdings of fossil fuel investments so that I will have a fossil fuel-free portfolio myself, in part because I am convinced that it will outperform the market. The third question, third statement from Tom, it does matter what we do. The kind of proxy voting that Mr. Earle recommends, Steyer says, will have, as he describes it, de minimis value. Divestment is the way to make yourselves heard, to make a statement about values far beyond the money involved. In particular, he says, it's a move that Middlebury needs to make. This is a college known worldwide for its leadership on environmental issues, from the country's first ES department to the birth of 350.org. A strong, as he says, a strong and well-defined mission is an incredibly valuable thing for a college or any institution. As my wife, CEO of a community development bank, often says, your mission is your advantage. I agree with Tom, and I am grateful for his boldness. For Middlebury, divestment is not a problem Middlebury, divestment is not a problem. It is an opportunity, one that we should seize now. I am very confident that we will. You will find in your packets there as you came in a letter drafted by students with great responsibility, not demanding immediate anything, but asking to meet with the Board of Trustees at its February meeting and asking for action to be taken as soon as possible in the semester to come. This is slower than other colleges, slower than the City of Seattle, slower than the California State Retirement Fund, but it is still at some kind of pace that might help us deal with the speed with which these problems are encroaching upon us. I am confident, I think I'm confident, that we will do it. It's hard to imagine how we could live with ourselves otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. If I could ask you all to take your seats again. I do want to do as good a job I can of honoring Ron's sort of pledge and his open invitation to the community that at least a third of our time tonight would be available for interactive Q&A with the audience and our panelists. But I also want to honor the pledge that we made to the panelists that we have at least some opportunity to sort of cross-examine or question each other. So I'll just sort of look to my left and look for a show of hands of anybody on the panel who has a question that they're keen to pose to a fellow panelist. I think I'll look first, Charlie, to you to see if, as a student rep, if you have anything. Oh? Sure.
Well, I guess my question would go to Ms. Handy. You talked about the sort of multi-tiered investment model that Middlebury has. So I guess my question is, you also mentioned in your conclusion the sorts of creative solutions that could be possible, and I was hoping you could maybe talk about those in a little bit more detail. What those creative solutions might look like, what sort of a time frame those might potentially have.
I guess I'm here as much to learn tonight, Charlie, as I am to have an answer to those questions. This is all relatively new. We're here to listen, to figure out what the. I am charged by the Board of Trustees, and so therefore, you know, I will be willing to work with them for whatever they do. But I just want to remind everybody that we have a consortium, and so Middlebury is just one client, so we have to be sure that all the clients agree with it.
Oh, so I mean, my question is in the context of that. So I'm not an econ major, I'm a poli-sci major, so
Right.
my honest question is, given that consortium model,
Right.
what sort of investment solutions are possible? You talked about the funds that Middlebury is a part of. Are similar sorts of models possible? Just, you know, your expertise on that would be appreciated, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, I think we all.
Sorry about that. We're good.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer for you.
Okay.
I really haven't gotten there yet in terms of thinking about it. It has a lot to do with, you know, how we think about our particular business model, and whether or not all of our clients or part of them do. One of the options is obviously to have different strategies for different groups, which we don't have in our business model now, so it would mean changing our whole business model if we wanted to go down that road.
Thank you.
Other questions from panelists for each other?
So, if I may,
Ralph, thanks.
I'd like to ask Bill and all of you. So let's roll this forward. Middlebury does divest, and it's joined by 50 other colleges. What are the outcomes with respect to the scientific issue of climate change that you hope would occur?
Sure. So let's hope that it's joined by many more than 50. In the case of South African divestment, 155 colleges joined in. We already have 210 where this is under active consideration. So, as I say, the thought is not that we're going to bankrupt Exxon. The thought is that their political power, their ability to, for 25 years to stifle any actual action in Washington, the fossil fuel industry, is in large measure dependent on their sense of legitimacy. And that's a kind of sense of legitimacy that can be peeled away from them by colleges, universities, religious denominations, municipal governments. It was precisely the thing that worked in South Africa. When Nelson Mandela was released from prison, the first place he came was to the United States. He did not go first to the White House or the Congress. He went first to Berkeley to thank students at the University of California who had forced the divestment of $3 billion worth of stock there. And what he said, and what Desmond Tutu has echoed over and over again, including in that video he made for 350.org, is that while South Africans obviously liberated themselves to a large degree, they were absolutely also crucially dependent on making sure that that they had this support from Americans. I think you're familiar with Bob Massey, the founder of Ceres, the Coalition for Environmentally Responsible Companies, or whatever it is. It's done much of the work on carbon reporting from companies and things, and engaged with them in just the manner that you've described as a good idea over the years. He also was very involved in the South Africa divestment movement and has now reached the point where he says that's the model that we need to bring to bear on energy, that we can no longer hope to do it by proxy voting or shareholder action, though people have tried for a very long time, and that instead we need tools like this, which is, I say, are to be used not in every case, only in dramatic cases.
Other questions from our panelists for each other? Okay, as we make the transition to some questions from the audience, again, our aim was to end at 9 o'clock, 9:10, something like that, but I'm certainly willing to go on depending on how much interest there is. Again, emphasizing the need for decorum and brevity. Ron mentioned this, I think, as well in one of his invitations. I'd encourage you, because there may be more rather than fewer people that like to pose questions to the panelists, why don't we all agree as a courtesy to each other, we'll limit your questions, and that's what we're looking for, not really comments. We're fortunate to have the experts that we have up here, to about a minute, not more than that, as a courtesy to each other. And as you think about whether you want to pose a question and frame it in your mind, I will emphasize that, to its credit, I think, the college has created sort of a sub-site on its website on which have already been posted a number of materials germane to this debate, which is just starting tonight. It will not end tonight. And I encourage all of you, and Ron, I'm not even sure whether we should do it through Bill Berger or through Patrick or through your office directly. Office of the President is an email address. To push materials that you think are germane, consistent with what we said at the outset. There's really no error that we should worry about as long as reason is free to combat it. So if you have anything that you think is germane to the debate, push it in that direction, and there'll be a filtering and a curating, but not because there's a bias, just to make sure there's no profanity or obscenity, and that the things that go on there are appropriate for the audience that we hope will review those primary sources, primarily, is what we're looking for. So any fact, any assertion, any opinion that you heard tonight or you'll hear in the future that you have a question about, see if you dig up material that you think is germane to its scrutiny and assessment, just push it that way and we'll put it up on the website. That's how we promote a full, fair, and informed debate about all these issues. They're difficult and complex ones. So with that as preface, we'll go 10, 20 minutes, we'll see how it goes, but does anybody want to be intrepid enough to step up and pose the first question? If you have a loud enough voice that carries, you can do it from right where you're sitting, but I think we do have some mics on the side, if I'm not mistaken. This young man, please, go right ahead.
Thank you very much.
You can go ahead and stand up. Your voice will carry a little better.
Thank you very much. My
Thanks.
name's Max Kagan. I'm a junior here. My question is for
Yeah, let's get Dave. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I don't really like these things, but I guess I have to. As I said, my name's Max Kagan. I'm a junior. My question is directed primarily, but not exclusively, towards Professor McKibben and Mr. Earle. My question is, I guess, do you see any potential downsides to divestment? And I'm not really talking about the cost to Middlebury, which I think Mr. Kurtzman did a pretty good job of enlightening us on that. But the reason I ask is, A, you have the opportunity cost, which is if you were to divest, you give up the chance to do some of the strategies that Mr. Earle talked about, namely proxy voting and shareholder activism. And also because in the three the empirical record as far as divestment, I see some unintended consequences of those divestment efforts. So in tobacco, we see that tobacco companies have remained profitable, even in the face of a strict regulatory environment in the U.S. and much of the developed world, by simply moving their efforts to exploit the most vulnerable people in the developing world, which is obviously not, it's a consequence that we might have not anticipated and something we might not like. With regard to Sudan, I've read some studies that suggest that the pullout of Monarch Oil, which was a Canadian company, was actually one of the few sources of leverage the international community had in Sudan, and the pullout might have actually led to more violence as the Sudanese regime became more desperate because it wasn't able to bring its oil to market. And the South African example is obviously the most complex. Desmond Tutu is a very accomplished man, but he's not an econometrist, and I'm not sure that just because he said divestment has an impact that we should take that claim at face value. And I have actually, while it's not a huge consequence, many white-owned, very exploitative apartheid-era firms benefited from divestment because they were able to scoop up assets at fire sale prices as international companies left. And so these are just some of the consequences. I'm not an expert, but I was just wondering if you see any potential downsides to divestment in the fight against climate change that we should be worried about.
Thanks, Max. Why don't we go left to right? Ralph, you want to go first, and then Bill?
So I think it's an excellent question. I'm going to articulate a cost. It's not a cost so much as it is an opportunity cost. When I was in government, I was Assistant Secretary of Environmental Affairs for the state of Massachusetts. There were 50 cool things we wanted to do. Doing one thing required you implicitly to make a choice not to do something else. And so, and by the way, I hope I'm wrong about divestment, but my conclusions are based upon 25 years of experience working in this field. I hope I'm wrong. So if you decide to expend enormous energy and time pursuing divestment and it doesn't work, it's not effective, then I think there's a huge opportunity lost in terms of where that energy could have been spent elsewhere. That's the primary downside that I see. There is incredibly cool stuff going on in renewables technology, and more particularly in the big nut we have to crack to move to a carbon-free economy, which is storage. Energy storage is where it's at. And I would argue that expending the time and intellectual energy on trying to figure out how we can do massive scale renewable storage is the single best step we can take to move to a carbon-free economy. But other than that, I frankly don't see a lot of cost other than that opportunity cost. The second point you raise is what I'll call second and third order effects. And by the way, the same arguments were made in South Africa by Gachagua Buthelezi, who ran the Zulu tribe, that the only forces for positive good were, in fact, the Western companies. You know, I think that our ability to accurately anticipate second and third order impacts is as close to zero as is measurable. So they will be there, but I think anybody who says that they can effectively anticipate what they will be is selling you something.
Okay,
Thanks, Ralph.
can I say first and foremost, if there's anybody in here who's close to cracking the problem of renewable storage in big batteries, go home right now and get to work on it, okay? Finish that project up. My guess is that working on divestment is not draining the pool of engineers who are at work on that. That's just my guess. But in fact, don't worry at all that we're working on lots of other things at the same time. This is not distracting our energy. We hope that some of you will join us on February 13th in Washington, D.C. for what we think, 17th, what we think will be the largest environmental rally in many years to fight the Keystone Pipeline and demand a kind of real Obama climate legacy. And don't worry about places around the world. 350.org, which started at Middlebury College 5 years ago, now works in 191 countries. We're well aware that this is a global business with players everywhere, and we are convening a global power shift summit in Istanbul in June that will have young people from all those places. I'm afraid that I found out today what my travel schedule for much of the rest of the year looks like, and I'm renewing my passport. We work all over the world, and so does the environmental movement. This is by no means the only thing that anyone's working on. It's by no means a silver bullet. It's one thing that we need to do, and here's why we need to do it. The most overwhelming reason that we have not moved towards renewables and things as quickly as we need to doesn't have to do with storage or anything else. It has to do with the fact that the economists like John Isham pointed out 20 years ago, there is no price on carbon. Fossil fuel companies, alone among industries, are allowed to pour their waste into the atmosphere for free. How do they manage to maintain that special perk that makes them the most profitable companies on earth? They do it by basically bending our political system to their will. So we have no way of knowing exactly what stocks we own, as I understand it. But if, say, we own Chevron, that means we helped give the largest campaign donation in the post-Citizens United world 2 weeks before the last election to climate denier members of Congress to make sure that nothing substantial would happen in this next Congress. It's precisely reasons like that that we need to try and break the power of this industry enough to give our champions in state houses and capitals around this country and around the world some room in which to maneuver, room that they've been denied for 25 years. And the idea that we would just sort of keep incrementally approaching things in the same way no longer makes sense. I mean, it made a certain amount of sense. One of the things that I have to keep reminding myself not to do, since I wrote the first book on all this 25 years ago, is to say to people, oh, if only you'd listened to me then, you know. There were a lot of things we could have done 25 years ago that would have helped a lot. Those things are no longer on the table in the same way. We now, we broke one of the largest physical features on Earth last summer, the Arctic. If we don't get our act together in a huge way, very quickly, then all this discussion is academic at best.
Another question from the audience? Yes, go ahead.
My question is for Alice Handy. So I assume that your company is trying to do the best for your clients, right? Then the question is,
you want to restate that, Alice, real quickly?
The question is, what demand are we getting from our clients to be...
What demand will it be required that we switch entirely to SRI?
Yeah, so who is demanding that we switch entirely to SR? Yeah, I understand. Yeah. Which ones have we got? As I said, it started with the Sustainability Fund, and there were 3 of our clients that signed up for that. And then it started with the proxy voting policy, which all of our clients endorsed. And so that's where we are at this point.
Why don't we, I want to give it, maybe you could...
The question, I think, if I understand it correctly, is how many of your clients need to support a move to SRI in order for you to make that move entirely?
100%. I mean, if we're going to stay in the same format that we have right now, it would take all of our clients to do it. In the current configuration.
Yeah, over here on the left.
But there's ranges within all this, yeah.
Go ahead.
Mr. Salem, thank you.
No, I'm recognizing that gentleman, and then I can come back to you. Go ahead.
My question is for someone to respond to these comments, if you wish. So, number 1, climate change is not a debate. It's been happening for Earth's 4.5 billion year history, and nowadays we're not talking on a geological timescale. We're paying close attention to the greenhouse effect, which is a very good thing. Only a little bit though. And if you increase greenhouse gas emissions, you'll increase the greenhouse effect, and you'll have climate change. It's not a debate. So that's the first comment. And so what's the problem if it's not a debate? Well, either the government is being manipulated, or they're scientifically illiterate. What's the solution? Have a scientifically literate electorate such that the leaders of the country, of all countries, will be scientifically literate as well. How do we achieve that? We have great communicators like Carl Sagan and Bill McKibben. I would like to see a panel on how to increase scientific literacy. Second comment to my fellow students. I care about Middlebury's image. I care about all of you. And what concerns me is when we make a sweeping comment about arms manufacturing. I come from a military family, and I hardly have a clue about what the military does, but I think I have a better clue than you do, and I know that we would not be alive if it wasn't for the U.S. military. If there's a company that makes just machine guns, by all means, let's not invest in that, but just be clear in what you say with arms manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mike? Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I think you were next.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just encourage everybody, this isn't an ad hominem, but let's focus on a question and try to keep it to a minute if we can, so we can hear from our experts who traveled a long way. So your question would be?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah,
Mr. Salem, I appreciate you saying that we should enter all information that would be germane to this conversation, and we will let it sort itself out. I would like us to recognize that we've already prevented that from happening by denying somebody from the communities most affected by climate change, the communities most affected by violence. And so we've actually reserved this front row here for those killed in Palestine this past week. We've reserved it for a future for our children. The frontline communities affected by Sandy. We've reserved it for Ibrahim Muhammad, Jamal Al-Dwale, Daniel Barden, a 7-year-old killed at Sandy Hook Elementary. So unfortunately, these voices weren't here tonight, which is really, really a shame. And I think that what we need to do, Mr. Kritzman, I appreciate your comments. You had a really great slide that said the cost of socially responsible investing. You said that it was inarguable that there is a cost. And, you know, I would concur. When you exclude all of these people, when you murder people, when you displace people, and you ignore that, there's going to be costs. However, when we honor the dignity of every living being on this earth, then the question becomes the cost to irresponsible investing. Yesterday was Martin Luther King Day, a man who stood for justice, a man who told us that we should ask a question, not what will happen if we act, but what will happen if we don't. So far, we haven't acted, and we've seen 20 children brutally murdered, which really hurts me as a future educator. But that's not all. There have been many communities displaced, and so long as we exclude them from the conversation, you are right. And I hope we follow the wisdom of those who have asked the questions and enabled us to be here today, and follow to Dr. King's wisdom. And what do we have to say to him? What can we do? What is his question? How does it charge us? And should these people be here? Are they human? Do we care about their voices? There is a cost to death. The cost is immeasurable.
So again, that was about 3.5 minutes, and I'll encourage you to keep your questions to a minute. Does somebody have a question? Yes, yeah. Yeah, thanks. Why don't you grab the mic?
Thanks. Hi, Teddy Smythe. So students here at Middlebury, along with students at Barnard, Smith, and Dixon College, along with the professor at Monterey College, associated with Middlebury, are organizing around the issue of divestment. There's been a lot of campus chatter. And we'd like to work with you and specifically Alice Handy, your managers, to learn more about what divestment would mean and how it would affect the endowment and how specifically we would go about it. So just a quick question, Alice, would you be willing to work with us in some way, in some capacity, to research this and lend sort of an academic ear to this struggle? Thanks.
Thank you. Next question? Yeah, sir.
Thank you, Spencer Egan. My question, I think, is directed towards Patrick Norton. Given the figures that Mr. Kritzman presented with the estimated cost, of course, they can't be exactly accurate, but given that ballpark, could you say anything to the kind of effect that sort of money would have on the endowment and how that's spent, especially considering the recent talk of need-blind admissions here at the school? Thank you.
Well, we've heard two studies spoken about. One was from Mark, and one was from Bill. One study did talk about maybe there's potential upside, and Mark's was that there's downside. So I'll address your point about Mark. Devastating, right? I mean, if you look out 20 years and look at $400 million of lost wealth, that would have a significant impact on the operating budget of the college. Even if you look at 5 years out, which I think the number was closer to $20 million, we're talking about 5% spend. So really just do the math that way. Look at the incremental cost or the opportunity cost and multiply by 5%, which is our spend rate, and that would be the impact on the operating budget. So when you bring up financial aid and need blind admissions, when you think about the cost structure of this institution, which includes faculty salaries and staff salaries and other things like that, then it would have a huge impact on that.
This young lady right here, go right ahead and stand up if you would. Maybe we can grab a mic. And again, if you can get your question out as crisply and succinctly as you can. Thank you.
Hi, this is a question for everyone, but probably mainly Ms. Handy and Mr. McKibben. That you mentioned, especially you, Mr. McKibben, I believe it was, that in the context of Middlebury, we're talking about not only divestment from companies that contribute to climate change, but also from arms manufacturers, which a couple of the other students mentioned. And I was wondering if you two could address in the context of Middlebury's endowment, what are we talking about in terms of fossil fuels and arms manufacturing divesting from all socially irresponsible companies, or kind of looking at separate issues, directing at which companies we would prefer not to be involved in?
So let me say a couple of things here first. One is that thanks to Ron, we actually have some information for the first time about our endowment. And we know that less than 1% is invested in arms manufacture, and about 3% slightly more in fossil fuels. So the entire universe that we're talking about here tonight is less than 5% of our endowment, okay? So keep that in mind when one starts talking scary things about how much money we're going to lose and so on and so forth. And keep in mind, as I said, that the best investment pros we've heard from tonight say it would probably make us money. One of the real issues that we face here, and one of the things that I think continues to be problematic, is that we've not only excluded our investments from the same logical consistency we've applied to everything else in terms of like greening our campus and things like that. We've, for some reason, decided to exclude investments from that. We've also kind of excluded them from the kind of intellectual scrutiny that we do everything else at this college. It's a black box. We have no idea what we're invested in. And that's really not something that, I think that's troubling reality for an institution devoted to inquiry. And I think it's going to make the project difficult of working with our managers to learn more about these things if they're unable to tell you what stocks they're invested in. But what we do know is it's less than 5% of the endowment that we're even beginning to talk about, and hence the effort to scare people. These numbers is, I think, falls a little flat, I must say.
Yeah, I'd just like to clarify a few issues on that.
Could you pull the mic up a little closer,
I agree
Alex?
that it's virtually, as you might say, de minimis, or certainly small. And if you take the ones that are in your top 200 companies that you have out there, it's only a little over 1% is in fossil fuels. That's not the issue. The issue is that we invest in commingled managers right now. And so it would mean divesting of the entire manager. So it has a lot broader implications than just that one stock, telling that one stock to get out of the portfolio. And so that's the issue that we're talking about. So it gets to be a lot larger number than just the amount that's in fossil fuels.
But that's good. So we've made some real progress here just in learning more. So now we know that, in fact, not 3%, but less than 1% in the criteria that we're talking about.
A little over 1%.
I would say that that makes the financial crisis that we've been sort of worried about a lot less of a problem than anyone's been talking about, okay? It changes the whole effect enormously, okay? I would also say that if the only argument against it is that it would mean a change of business model for our, I'm certain that you are an excellent investor and your company is full. One of the good things about capitalism is that with $900 million to spare, if we say we want something else, I'm almost certain that there'll be somebody who will fill that need and provide it, okay? And that's a good thing to know.
I think we'll just do a couple more questions, and then I just have a closing comment or two. Yeah, this young man with the mic, go right ahead. Where's our LIS help? Yeah, thank you.
Now it's on. Okay, so my question is primarily towards Professor Kitzman, but also Earl and McKibben. You suggested an interesting statistic. Well, the $420.5 million that we currently are considering divesting, you suggest if we didn't divest, instead we could put it all towards a solution, financial solution that would be completely consistent with Middlebury's values. Now, to me, this sounds like it might be like capitalism covering up with one hand what it destroyed with the other. But that's a value statement. So my question is twofold. First, what solutions would be more effective than directly pulling out from the cause of the problem? And second, do you think it's feasible for Middlebury, if we were not to divest, to spend this $420.5 million directly on its values, essentially environmentalism and weapons manufacturing, like preventing that from happening?
Mark, you want to start us out? Yeah.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So first, let me remind you what I said at the outset. I am all in favor of solving this problem as efficiently as possible. So you seem to think that I'm somehow on the other side of the issue as you are. I'm all about which is the better approach. And let me also apologize. I'm sorry for trying to inject some science and rationality into the conversation. I didn't know how unappealing that approach would be. But, and let me just to try to diffuse the, the very strong feelings that are here tonight. Let's just talk about tobacco, okay, because that's not on the table tonight. And so here's the choice. Let's just say that we all agree on a methodology. We all agree, that this is correct mathematics. We all agree that these assumptions are the most reasonable assumptions we can make. And we determine that there's a cost. Okay? So we can restrict investment in tobacco companies, and I'm not saying that's not a good thing to do. It probably is a good thing to do. Or, and we'll say it costs, $1,000. We could take, or $1 million or $100 million. So the choice is we can do that and hope by doing so that we reform these companies or do something to curb the use of tobacco, right? In an indirect way. And that may be the better way to do it. Alternatively, we can take that, not do that, take the costs that we avoided, right, those savings, and endow a chair to do research in, cancer research or marketing to influence, consumer behavior and so forth. There are many, many things that we could do with those monies. I'm just saying these are two alternatives. And why, if you're honest with yourselves, why wouldn't you want to know which alternative is more effective?
Can I just, I want to, since you asked me to, let me just say something here. Let's drop, one of the useful things of an inquiry like this is we get more facts out on the table. There is no $420 million cost at stake here or anything like it. We've figured out tonight that 1% of our endowment or less is invested in the 200 companies that we're interested in. That means about $9 million. There is no way over the next next 20 years that changing the way that we invest that $9 million can cost us $420 million, nor make us $420 million, or anything like it. That's not what we're talking about.
You have to remember one thing, and that is that if we do go with an entirely different model, you are excluding still the same percentage of the universe that Mark talked about. So it's not just what you'd be divesting here, it's what the universe is.
And what we found
moreover, if all of these other institutions copied you, then maybe it is $400 million or $4 billion.
Well, maybe so, but that's not, maybe if you added it up over the whole world, it would turn into $400 million, but that's not a, that's, I don't have any idea how you make that calculation, but it's not an important sum for our figuring out here, it seems to me. Second thing, to your question of wouldn't we be better to just, do some research here and make that our mission and whatever. I want to refer people to what I think is the tremendously interesting piece that we included, released tonight, that's in that divestment reader that was handed out today. It comes from James Powell, who was president of Oberlin, president of Franklin and Marshall, and president of Reed. And one of the things he says in here is, quotes the president of Harvard as saying, our job is in fact to do research, and that's how we're going to most powerfully affect the world around us. As he points out, it hasn't done it yet. Okay? All that research should continue and it should go on, but at a certain point, we have to act on what we know. At a certain point, it's not going to make sense to keep teaching, for Rich Wolfson to keep teaching the physics of climate change, for people to be doing endless work here about climate change. If we can't even persuade our own college to take some action on it, why the heck do we even bother to learn about it? It becomes a kind of exercise in masochism at a certain point if we don't actually take what advantage we can to do something about it.
Ralph, did you want to comment? We'll do maybe one more question from the audience after you have an opportunity to comment, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I'll just say, as somebody who spent 25 years in the environmental field, it is an exercise in masochism. In my opinion, the critical missing piece right now is United States political leadership on climate change. It is absolutely absent. There was one hopeful moment yesterday in President Obama's inaugural speech. For the first time, he put it front and center. And I think the alternatives to be considered, and Bill, you said legitimacy of the oil industry, I would argue they have no legitimacy other than money, which they spend a great deal of on Capitol Hill. But the missing piece, not just in the U.S., but globally, is U.S. political leadership on climate change. If we can change that, and if you all decide in your wisdom that divestiture of the Middlebury Endowment is the best tool you have available, do it. But that's the missing piece, and that's what we need to have.
Absolutely agreed. And that's exactly the reason to do it, to try and clear out some space for our political leaders. And it's why a lot of those political leaders have asked us to do precisely this, the kind of champions that we have on Capitol Hill. It's why people, I mean, even as far to the right as the Republican governor of Utah, John Huntsman, saying this is one of the few effective things that we have left to do.
Thank you, Bill. So I'm going to exercise a little editorial control here. I think our panelists in the main will agree to stay and talk with you one-on-one. But we've gone for 2 hours. I think it's been a good initial session, and I do want to honor my pledge. I have to get Mark back to Logan Airport tonight, so I want to thank him in particular for his time. I also made a separate pledge to the panelists, to Ron, to Patrick, and others, that I would try to maintain neutrality throughout the evening, and I've tried to do that. I may have failed in your eyes. I may have succeeded. I will say, without suspending that pledge, that I've heard a lot of things tonight from the panelists and from the audience that don't ring true to me. And so that's why we've asked the college to set up the website so that you can judge for yourselves from primary sources and contribute to that process, as I've already indicated, so I won't repeat myself. Let's have it. Let's have the facts. Let's have the primary sources. Let's get to work on this and see if we can have a reasoned and cordial and courteous debate. And I thank the panelists and all of you who participated for letting us do just that tonight. Thank you all very much.